interdisciplinary minor in constitutional studies and also in the political science department. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon event. Let me begin by thanking several individuals. First and foremost, let me recognize the Kellogg Institute and its director, Paula Trotzer. They're co-sponsoring today's event. So special thanks to Paula and his leadership. And I'm sure everyone in this room knows, especially those people who administered something, people who really do the work are the staff. So let me thank my assistant, Jen Smith, here in front, and Teresa Hanlon of the Kellogg Institute. I mean, they've really done all the work, so thank you, Jen. The undergraduate minor in constitutional studies was just launched this year. I know we have several minors in the audience. Thank you for coming. If the minor might be of interest to any of the undergraduates here, please come talk to me or talk to Jen after the lecture. And we also have a flyer out on the table with some of Professor Agresto's books, so you can find out a little bit more about the minor there. And if you do this sort of thing, you can like us on our Facebook page. The minor is made possible by a gentleman named Frank Potenziani. The minor is actually named after in memory of his son David, who's a 2001 graduate of Notre Dame. So let me recognize the Potenziani family as well. March 20th, 2013 will mark the 10-year anniversary of the beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Despite the bravery of our troops, I'm not sure that this is an anniversary we ought to celebrate. It is an anniversary, however, that should lead us to pause, to reflect, and to take stock of what we have accomplished and also what we have failed to accomplish. There are various reasons offered, of course, for sending our troops to Iraq. One was the promotion of democracy. And I don't know that there's anyone who can offer a more interesting or better perspective on our success and failure of democracy promotion in the Middle East than John Agresto. In 2003, Dr. Agresto was asked personally by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld to head our efforts to rebuild higher education in Iraq under the auspices of the Coalitional Provisional Authority. After serving as senior advisor to the Ministry of Higher Education in 2003 and 2004, Professor Agresto remained in Iraq to help found the American University of Iraq, at which he was provost and chancellor. And the last time I saw John before he arrived on campus yesterday was actually in Iraq, where I was able to deliver a handful of lectures. Professor Agresto wrote about his time in Iraq in his memoir, Mugged by Reality, The Liberation of Iraq and the Failure of Good Intentions. We have copies of the book available, which Professor Agresto would be happy to sign, I'm sure, for anyone after the talk. I enthusiastically recommend the book. I was telling the professor, I actually read it in one sitting. It's absolutely fascinating, and I think I haven't read all the books, of course, that were published after all the memoirs and accounts of the Iraqi War. But of all the ones I read, it was, I thought, by far the most insightful, and I very much encourage you to read it. Professor Agresto is a political scientist by training, and also a highly decorated and successful administrator, having been president of St. John's College in Santa Fe for 11 years. And in his book, In Mugged by Reality, he brings together both theoretical knowledge of constitutionalism and the practical wisdom of experience to explain what we as a nation did right, but especially what we did wrong, or could have and should have done better in the first 4 years of our adventure in Iraq. His talk today is titled, Is Promoting Democracy in the Middle East a Mistake? Please join me in welcoming to the podium John Agresto.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Munoz. That might help, I guess, if I did that. And is this, and my mic, this other mic's on? Perfect. This is my first time in Notre Dame, and I'm very happy to be here. I was always a little afraid of coming because I'm a BC graduate, and I didn't know what the reception would be like. And I still think it'd be better if I had, gone to, I don't know, Kansas State or something. But the reception's been really delightful so far. Thank you. I want to thank Professor Munoz. I want to thank Jen Smith. I want to thank the Kellogg Institute for helping out with this program. This has been a truly delightful time. I get to see old friends. I saw Catherine and Michael Zuckert, and Michael just told me that he now realizes that I have come around to his way of thinking. So I'm throwing this speech out because I recant everything. I'll still read the speech, but I don't believe in a word of it anymore. All the silliness and mistakes in here belong to Professor Zuckert, the male Professor Zuckert. Okay. So thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. The title of the talk is, as Professor Munoz said, is promoting democracy in the Middle East a mistake? Even though this is going to be a talk about ideas and culture and politics, I want to begin by doing what the nuns told me never to do. I want to talk about myself. I know Professor Munoz just told you all about me, but that's the official sanitized version. The rest of the story is far crazier. I first went to Iraq in 2003 and stayed in that country off and on until the very end of 2010. I went not as an expert in Middle Eastern politics, but rather as a professor of political philosophy and American politics and American history. I also know a good bit about education, especially liberal education, though I have to admit I was once president of a for-profit graduate school of education in Chicago, which has to be as far from the liberal arts as one could possibly imagine going. And I tend to be, despite all the odd and even outrageous things I've done in my time, a fairly conservative person, which means I subscribe to some rather conservative American positions. For example, I've always believed that all human beings are equally endowed with inalienable rights, that freedom, and let me single out freedom of conscience and freedom of religion, are truly universal values, that while repressive regimes might deny people these and other rights, the people, nonetheless, would jump at the opportunity to possess them. Above all, I always believe that justice doesn't change from place to place. For example, that the humiliation and subjugation of women, or the direct and willful killing of the innocent, are always and everywhere moral evils. I thought, in other words, rather conservatively, that both cultural relativism and historicism were wrong. And although I am not about to jettison those views of mine entirely, you will soon see that I do want to modify them. And I want to modify them along these lines. While justice and right might indeed be universal, and their commands valid no matter where you are or when, nonetheless culture, the habits and customs and outlooks of a people have power to change what might at first blush seem morally obvious. That while certain truths might be self-evident, they may actually be so only in a technical, philosophical sense. Self-evident truths may indeed be true, yet still not be widely evident, not evident to every self, much less evident to whole nations. Let me begin with the story of a minor episode. It's in the book there that Professor Munoz mentioned. A minor episode that brought home to me that even if we adhere to the view that there's a human nature that all of us share, we sometimes see the content of that nature radically differently. Back in 2003, in my first sojourn into Iraq, I had the occasion to spend an afternoon with the dean of one of the colleges of science at the University of Baghdad. He was trying, he said, to understand why we Americans were there. He was happy that we were there, mind you. That was not a problem. But he was just having a hard time figuring out why we would do it. He knew that the usual reason that we were there to take Iraq's oil, that didn't hold up. We also managed to put to rest, at least I think we managed, I'm not sure, to put to rest his own pet theory. His own pet theory was along these lines, that since the Supreme Court said a long time ago, he thought, Supreme Court told us that we couldn't have blacks for slaves anymore. We were there, we Americans were there to snatch Iraqi children and turn them into our domestic servants. After all, he was certain the court never said anything about holding Arabs as slaves. It made sense to him. I know, it's hard to believe that a university dean would say something that silly, but believe me, it happens. It just does. Well, I told him that I hesitated to speak for everyone, yet it still seemed to me that almost all the Americans whom I knew were not there to snatch up unsuspecting children, but there, I put it simply, to help. To help rebuild roads and hospitals, or to help their banking system up, or to help get their refineries working, or, as I was, to help restore their schools and universities. There might have been additional reasons each of us had, but a willingness and a desire to help a newly liberated people was certainly a part of it. At this, he just laughed. "Don't be crazy," he said. "You're not here to help. Nobody leaves home and country and family to go to another country to help. It's unnatural. It's simply against everything in our human natures." And then the kicker, "You know, we would never do that for you." In that, of course, he was right. The Iraqis would never, not in 1,000 years, do that for us. Yet who was the odd one? The dean? Or Americans who believe that people should go to the aid of those in need, even strangers? And why do we always confuse what we learn through our religion, our history, and our moral stories with universal human commands? Culture, as I will soon try to argue, virtually always directs activity and frames our understanding, and culture therefore sets up and supports or makes impossible different kinds of political life. Well, before I jump into this afternoon's topic, is democracy a viable possibility in the Middle East? Let me note for the record that the story of America's democratic nation building goes back some time. And much of it's been quite successful. We managed to export one or another variety of decent democratic rule to Germany, Italy, and Japan after the Second World War. We managed to help many of the formerly occupied countries of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere, become viable, stable, free democracies. Western Germany, to go further, managed to incorporate East Germany into its own democratic way of life. Taking nations from autocracy and tyranny to some variety of freedom and democracy seems quite normal to us Americans. Normal. After all, we might say, isn't that the way people want to live? Isn't that the way people were meant to live, democratically? But when we look at the Middle East, when we look at Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Afghanistan, I think we all sense that the old paradigmatic picture of advancement from autocracy to democracy, or from tyranny to freedom, doesn't seem to hold. The sort of Papagalian view that the history of the world is the history of the spirit of freedom on the march doesn't ring true. Some of you, I think, may have seen an article I wrote that appeared in Commentary magazine, and it began this way. I realize this is one sentence, don't hold it against me. As sectarian violence in the Middle East increases, as Iraq falls further into the orbit of Iran, as Afghanistan seems poised to soon hand over its corrupt democracy to terrorists and Taliban murderers, and as American interests and lives are sacrificed to the depredations of the so-called Arab Spring, it might be worthwhile to take stock of what this unfolding debacle means for a general, and I dare say generous, American belief in the virtues and rightness of democratic rule for all. Take stock of what it means to be promoters of democracy everywhere in the world. Since I began this talk by mentioning a story from my first days in Iraq, the story with the dean, let me begin there. Let me begin in Iraq. And let me begin by putting all my cards on the table. I was, from the start of the campaign to liberate Iraq from Saddam, not only an actor on the ground, but a strong believer in our efforts there. As I said before, I went to Iraq in the summer of 2003 as a civilian working for the Pentagon, and I have been in Iraq for the better part of the last decade, having finally left Iraq at the very end of 2010. I was certain from the very first days of shock and awe that the war there was not only good, but that our planting the seeds of democratic rule in that part of the world was very good. Because I tended to believe that all people yearn for freedom and deserve to govern themselves, I thought that what we were attempting was good for Iraq and all Iraqis. Moreover, because I looked forward to seeing a democratic nation rise out of the ruins of a Ba'athist tyranny, I thought we were surely raising up a future international friend, perhaps even an ally for America. And since I knew, political scientist that I am, knew that liberal democracies virtually never war against other liberal states, I had hoped that a friendly, freedom-loving democracy would be good for peace in the region that had not seen much peace before. Yet it soon became clear that the distance between my expectations on one hand and political reality on the other was daily growing wider. We were, to be sure, steadily advancing some type of democracy in Iraq. There were political parties and elections and the writing of a constitution. But the peace, the toleration, the personal liberties, the moderation of violent passions that we hoped would follow in the wake of democracy's advent seemed, to be honest, further away than ever. Something clearly was going wrong. This was brought home to me not long after I first went to Iraq, when I met with a number of Iraqi parliamentarians charged with putting together the new constitution. We spent 3 intensive days talking about representation, taxation, federalism, rights, religious freedom, the whole range of issues we all knew the new Iraq would have to address. At one point I said something I took to be obvious, that the reason to take such pains in writing the new constitution was to assure that Iraq would have a good democracy and not a bad one. One of the participants looked at me, and this was a wonderful guy, one of the nicest Iraqis you could people you'd ever want to meet, looked at me as if I had just said something not only mistaken, but absolutely astounding. He raised his hand and said he couldn't believe what he had just heard. How could there be such a thing as a bad democracy? Wasn't America always telling everyone how good democracy was? Wasn't that the reason they were there, to get rid of their old ways and usher in democracy? I was totally perplexed. Given the level of discourse of almost all Americans in political authority whom I knew, he was right to be taken aback. What then was general American excitement regarding the possibilities of a democratic Iraq, which subsequently morphed into an even wider enthusiasm over the coming Arab Spring, would surely have led anyone to think that increasing the number of democracies worldwide was a pillar of American foreign policy and in itself a most desirable thing. What was begun in good measure by neoconservative theorists and promoted by the Bush administration, later became the cornerstone of American foreign policy under the Obama administration. To both of them, both conservative and liberal, the promotion of democracy worldwide seemed indeed a very good thing. Now, just reflect for a moment on how different this optimism of ours regarding democracy is, this current optimism of ours, from just a few decades ago. It wasn't that long ago when virtually everyone understood that there were good democracies and bad democracies. Once every school child knew that our democratic revolution, which culminated in national independence and a democratic constitution, was good, and the highly democratic French Revolution, which culminated in the terror and the guillotine, was bad. But today, there are those who cheer every movement abroad towards democratization without giving it a thought if the democracy being created is liberal or repressive, moderate or fanatical, good or bad. Lest the retort be made that good and bad are matters of opinion, that it's simply a question of my values versus another's, let me just put my values on the table. I tend to prefer nations that are tolerant of various religious views, that are respectful of rights, that have some understanding of the rule of law, and that are more or less peaceful towards their neighbors. If you want to call something else good, be my guest. So what led me to rethink the view that the coming of democracy to Iraq and subsequently to the whole of the Middle East and beyond would be a good thing? First, to be honest, it was the candor and clear-sightedness of many of the Iraqis I worked with in Baghdad, especially Iraqis who were either secular Muslims or who belonged to religious or ethnic minorities. Unlike we Americans who thought of democracy as an end, as a good in itself, these Iraqis knew that democracy is simply another form of arranging power. They understood the obvious, that democracy is a means, sometimes a good means and sometimes a bad means, to reach the real goals of political life: peace, prosperity, justice, liberty, security. Those are the real goals of political life. But we Americans insisted that those things all followed in democracy's wake. It was through democracy that the good results of political life would become real. In this view, democracy is a sort of medicine, something administered to countries to make them better. And then what will flow from that is peace, prosperity, justice, liberty, and security. Indeed, we seem convinced of two related things. First, that democracy was how all men were meant to live, that unlike autocracy of whatever kind, democracy was just in itself. Being just, it included in its very essence the ideas of freedom, equality, protection of rights, and toleration. Democracies were natural, democracies were how men achieved a just political life, and most assuredly, democracy meant freedom. Second, and equally problematic, we constantly gave the impression that being natural, democratic government was easy. Throw off the tyrant, overturn the ruling class, write a constitution, hold elections, and voila, democracy. In all this, we held to an understanding both alien to our own democratic beginnings, as well as removed from any reading of history, ancient or modern. To be seduced by the rising tide of democracy worldwide, we had to block from view the democratic elections in Gaza, where a terrorist organization bent on the destruction of its sovereign neighbor won the day. One had to forget that a quasi-military rule in Pakistan was overthrown, and the new, more democratic government now plays the role of a double agent in the war on terrorism while it works to destabilize further an already unstable Afghanistan. One had to forget that in a more democratic Afghanistan, not one Christian institution, church, charitable organization, school, not one of them is left. And apostasy is not only punishable by death in theory, but also in fact. Perhaps one might want to look at the democratic mobs in Libya, executing all blacks they capture, both men and women, or the mobs in Egypt burning Coptic churches or rallying almost daily for the destruction of Israel. And all this that I've listed, all this before the latest attack on American consulates and embassies and the taking of American lives. So what went wrong? How could so many thoughtful and politically savvy Americans, including so many in the State Department, at the Pentagon, as well as those in high elected political office, hold to a view whose consequences seem so unconducive to freedom, to security, and especially to peace? How could so many otherwise careful readers of history, both liberals who thought they could speak for the aspirations of people in the Middle East and conservatives who fancied themselves to be partisans of the American founders, be so blasé about spreading democracy elsewhere or wherever? Well, let me try to answer that question, and I want to begin somewhat superficially. First, I think our understanding of government was defective. Perhaps because of the success we had in America with democracy, we now think that democratic government doesn't have to be crafted, but merely willed into being. Doesn't have to be crafted, but simply willed. What we are learning the hard way in the Middle East is that there's little in politics harder to create than just and stable democracy. Nothing takes more art, more human effort, and more intelligence to design than a good democracy. Autocracies are easy. Rule by tyrants or elders or by the mob is easy. But a liberal and just democracy is hard to make and even harder to maintain. What else about government did we fail to understand? Well, the most obvious mistake was to make so easy an elision, so easy an identification between democracy and freedom. I said a few minutes ago that the flourishing of liberal democracies worldwide was good for both our own security and for the safety of free countries everywhere. But the operative phrase is liberal democracies, not simply democracies. There is little that is clearer in today's politics than what we have encouraged, supported, and even fought and died for in the Middle East are not liberal democracies. Nor is it simply that the protection of the rights of women or secularists or Christians and other minority religious sects is not apparent. Even within the predominant culture itself, we see smaller Islamic or tribal and ethnic minorities harassed and persecuted every day. Our notion that the overthrow of autocracy and the coming of democracy was also the coming of freedom was simply wrong. Yes, those, as we mentioned before, those who thought that the promotion of democracy would also bring about the birth of freedom in the region could point to the liberation of Eastern Europe from Soviet hegemony, or the liberation or the liberal democracy building in Germany and Japan, or even the wonderful success of our own civil rights movement here in America, to prove that all peoples wish to live in freedom. But those examples, fine as they are, seem not to carry us to the facts of what we see around us today. But why? Don't all men wish to be free? The former President George W. Bush repeatedly asked that question. Don't all men wish to be free? My neoconservative colleagues would always ask. And the assumed answer was always, well, yes. But the correct answer to the question, don't all people yearn for freedom, is no. No. Some people, perhaps most people, prefer other goods. Some people would rather be holy than free, or safe than free, or be instructed in how they should lead their lives rather than be free. Many people prefer the comfort of strong answers already given than the openness and hazards of freedom. There are people who would never dream of substituting their will for the imams or for pushing their desires over the customs and traditions of their families. Some men, to use an older metaphor, kiss their chains. As good Americans, we may wish to say, and I would say this, we may wish to say that all people deserve freedom, but to say that all people desire it is flat out wrong. Nevertheless, to ask, don't all men want to be free, is to ask exactly the wrong question. The right question is, do you want your neighbor to be free? And if the answer comes back, my neighbor worships false gods. Or my neighbor's tribe is full of thieves and assassins and needs to be exterminated. Or my neighbor's views will lead this country to eternal damnation. If that's the answer you get, you can be certain that the raw material upon which to build a truly free and liberal democracy is not there. Democracy, we need to understand, is rule by the people. Democracy, more than any other government, takes on the character of its people. Democracy, more than any other government, takes on the character of its people. But if the people are intolerant or rabidly sectarian, if they're accustomed to being told how to live rather than to make their own futures, if they see all human exchanges are zero-sum, with every neighbor's success a subtraction from their own, or if there's no patriotism, no real love of neighbor, no willingness to compromise, then liberal democracy is close to impossible. So far, I've reflected on two problems we faced in trying to spread liberal democracy abroad. The first is political. We have always understood, we Americans have always understood, going back to the time of our founders, that the protection and growth of liberty requires certain institutions, certain political arrangements. We here in the United States are attached to checked and balanced government, an independent judiciary, a written constitution with an enforceable Bill of Rights, calendared elections, federalism, local government, vibrant civic institutions, and above all, separation of church and state. We attach to them not merely because they are ours, but because through their efficacy, they have enabled, in America, decent and free government to flourish. Are these same institutions necessary everywhere? No, of course not. But some way of politically moderating and checking excess majority power is vital if democracies have any hope of being temperate, tolerant, and just. The American founders understood this in spades. The reason why the founders could give us a democracy that has survived well for over 200 years is because they were so clear about the need for institutional arrangements that would limit excessive power, protect minorities from overbearing majority, that is democratic rule, and keep some issues in the hands of all of us as private individuals and out of the realm of compulsion altogether. In other words, the founders of our country understood how to arrange democratic institutions so as to protect freedom and the future of democracy itself. Besides institutions, the founders understood one thing that was essential in making democracies just and free. As James Madison so carefully argued, the most important political ingredient in democratic freedom has always been pluralism. No matter what political institutions you have, if the nation is a divided nation rather than a pluralistic nation, liberal democracy will fail. If the term pluralism sounds too old-fashioned or political sciencey, substitute diversity. It amounts to much the same thing. Now, it doesn't matter if the divide in the country is between a few rich and the many poor, or between Catholics on one side and Protestants on the other, or between farmers and ranchers, or between believers and infidels, or between Sunnis and Shia. Wherever there's a majority side with passionate interests and a smaller minority side, the minority will consistently lose. Sadly, in the various Arab Spring nations, divisions are everywhere and pluralism all too rare. So far I've talked about the political necessities, institutional necessities for liberal democracy. But if the first problem is political, institutions and pluralism, the second and perhaps more serious problem is cultural. We political scientists have something of a professional fiction we like to entertain. We think that the type of government people live under shapes their culture. Indeed, we believe that political life shapes human character. We believe, to use the jargon of the trade, that politics is architectonic. So we think that aristocracies produce a society with aristocratic values, aristocratic desires, and aristocratic honor. That tyrannies produce a culture of fear and dependency with slavish or vicious subjects. And that democracy will produce a culture that is tolerant, peaceful, and understanding of difference. But this might simply be backwards. I was always struck by Alexis de Tocqueville, who in writing about America made it clear that we were on our way to being a democratic people, a democratic nation, long before we established a democratic government. We served on colonial juries, where we listened to both sides before we rendered judgment on our fellow citizens. We had professional, civic, and social institutions that taught us how to work together. We fought a revolutionary war against the British Crown, a war in which perhaps a third of our citizens were on the British side. Yet after the war, there were no show trials, no recriminations, no mass graves. You don't know how singular in human history that is. A revolutionary war with traitors in our midst, and afterwards there are no show trials, no recriminations, no mass graves, not one. Unheard of. Most importantly, over the years before our revolution, we in America and in the West in general tamed the fury of religious sectarianism. There's a long list of both fortuitous and calamitous events that led to the taming of religion, the taming of Christianity to be exact, here in the West. Liberal and Enlightenment philosophy and the rise of commerce that diverted men's interest away from sectarian ferocity are among the fortuitous events. The torture, maiming, and killing of almost a third of Europe's population in the religious wars of the 16th and 17th century can be counted as among the most horrible of events. But whatever the reasons, while we had not erased religious differences, we had by and large erased sectarian warfare as part of the culture. We had, by the end of the 18th century, pretty much established in the West sufficient democratic habits to give rule by the ballot rather than rule by the bullet a more or less secure foundation. To do it the other way around, to begin by establishing democratic government and hope for people with democratic outlooks and habits to grow as a result, is, I believe, a fool's errand. Now, this might be obvious to many of you, that culture, especially religious culture, can make or break the prospects of democracy. But this view is not without its antagonists, especially in our modern, politically correct world. For example, you would think that the left, which often speaks about diversity and multiculturalism and the importance of culture, should understand this matter better than the right. You would think. Yet while liberals may claim to see the formative nature of culture, I generally don't think they go deep enough. Often the left, it seems, would rather have us celebrate other cultures than fully or deeply understand them. For understanding the other might lead us to judge it, even oppose it. Above all, despite their attachment to the virtues of multiculturalism, rarely will the left admit that culture, especially religious culture, shapes a nation's and a people's character. To the left, culture matters, except where it really matters, in the soul. Yet it's the character of the culture, whether it countenances independence, initiative, and religious and intellectual freedom on one hand, or obedience, hierarchy, and division on the other, that will shape the aspirations of its citizens and thus the nature of its democracy. A culture in which there is little religious or intellectual freedom, where adherence to the command of imams or religious scholars is sacrosanct, a culture that sees as its duty before God to punish dissent, kill apostates, and exterminate God's supposed enemies, a culture where there is no deep acceptance of difference, such cultures will produce illiberal souls who are hardly strong candidates to form a truly liberal and free democracy. Nor is the right without fault in this matter. My neoconservative friends especially, with their insistence on the universality of human nature and human desires and the secondary character of culture, fail to see the true centrality of culture in shaping human life. All too often, conservatives rail against multiculturalism and proclaim that the important thing to know is that all men share a common human nature. They are the first to proclaim that just as fire burns the same in both Hellas and in Persia, so it is true that human beings are the same deep down the world over. But culture, custom, as Pascal called it and pointed out, is use Pascal's phrase, a second nature. Not just something that affects how we dress, or what we eat, or what festivals we like to celebrate, but something with the force of human nature itself. Culture, especially today religious culture, shapes a people's aspects, outlooks, aspirations, and above all, shapes what it holds to be just and what it holds to be dishonorable. Remember, if you will, my colloquy with the Iraqi Dean of Science. The very thought that Americans would volunteer to go to a foreign country in the midst of a war to help, he saw as laughable, ridiculous. He said it was unnatural. Yet I knew it was true. I saw it every day with my own eyes. But I also know that it's an impulse that arises more from Jefferson's words that all men are created equal, coupled with the teaching of our religious heritage, than from the demands of our common human natures. Nature says, stay home and be safe. But the example of the Good Samaritan, an example, I think, that is deeper in our culture than most of us ever think about, always says, go and help. Well, let me get back to the qualms of conservatives about the formative role of culture. While conservatives may be correct in saying that justice and right are universal and that good and evil are independent of historical circumstances or any person's cultural outlook, the fact remains that what a person believes is just and unjust, and what leads him to act, is always shaped more by his culture than by the truth objectively understood. That is, while the love of justice might be natural to all humanity, the content and meaning of that justice is far more often decided by custom and culture than by argument or philosophy. What people know, and importantly, what they act on, is what their culture, again, especially their religious culture, tells them is good or evil, noble or shameful. How is it that we Americans always seem to confuse what we've learned through our religion, our history, and our moral stories with universal human commands? Let me address one further word to my more conservative comrades. Despite a general academic conservative disdain for multiculturalism, there's something correct about multiculturalism that cannot be overlooked. The truth of multiculturalism is not that all cultures are equal or that all cultures are good in their own way, but that cultures are different and culture matters. Some social structures encourage individual effort and reward, and these will result in distinctly different societies from those that encourage envy and dependence. Some religions are more bellicose than others, and then so will be their adherents. The task of today's multicultural studies, as well as much of the liberal arts, is not to prettify other ways of life or help us celebrate other cultures, nor is it to remake other cultures according to our wishes or in our own image, nor is it to show us comfortable similarities or help us to see the common threads of our humanity, nor is it to make believe that all cultures are equally valuable. In this dangerous and unfriendly world, the task of the study of other cultures is simply to understand them deeply and clearly and plainly. Okay, to return to the matter directly at hand, whether or not the spread of democracy is desirable or even, for that matter, possible. The simple fact is that freedom and democracy have political, social, and cultural preconditions. And there are some nations, many nations where the preconditions for just and democratic rule are absent. So how sanguine should we be about the prospects for liberal democracies in the world? If history is any guide, what will ultimately happen is that the tumultuousness of the Arab Spring will probably not lead to a calm or steady growth of democratic life, but rather, to use my friend Don Rumsfeld's words, life will get messier, a lot messier. The partisans of the old regime, the military, the secularists and liberals, and some religious and tribal minorities on one hand, will continue to clash with Islamists of different stripes and whatever the predominant ethnic or tribal group turns out to be. Above all, it will be a period of continued and even increased repression against women, against discrete minorities, and pointedly against Christians and a few other smaller religious sects. Already one of the major religious watchdog houses lists Iraq, where I spent so much time, as one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a Christian. Fourth, actually, just under North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and the other place we had hoped to bring freedom and democracy, Afghanistan. In the end, what was hoped would bring order, stability, and liberty to the region will bring about exactly the opposite, a mix of both instability and repression. But politics abhors instability. Anarchy, chaos, is never a lasting order. Soon, new orders will arise, but they will not be democratic orders. For all our giddiness over the Arab Spring, we'll soon see those nations, including, sadly, Iraq, and especially Afghanistan, turn back to the same place they began, namely repressive rule by strong men or party or religious despots. The only difference is that America will have lost whatever previous allies it may have had under formerly tyrannical regimes, harmed any number of our short-range national interests, and have done permanent damage to our few true allies in the region. Despite this pessimism, and it's clearly severe and deep pessimism on my part, it's not true to say that all is irretrievably lost. Nations and people do change. Religious toleration, as I said before, was not always the hallmark of the West. The moral evil of American slavery gets eliminated, even if it means the sacrifice of 600,000 lives. We have even in the last century seen nominally Islamic strongmen, I have Turkey in mind in particular, promote the education and liberation of women, protect religious minorities, and work to secularize everyday life. Culture can be and is ferociously powerful, but culture can change. Sadly, where the people of a nation are themselves strongly sectarian, intolerant of difference, and skeptical of the equality of all that gives dignity and freedom to all, the promotion of democracy may well hinder rather than promote this change. The promotion of democracy may well hinder rather than promote this change. For you see, rather than changing the character of a people, the purer a democracy is, the more it cements and even magnifies the character of a people. The outlook, the demands of the majority now rule. It has now the force of law, and it wields the instruments of power. Democracy might not only not promote freedom in the Middle East, it may actually retard it, and retard it worse than the autocratic governments might have done that they replaced. So, should America continue its attempt to spread democracy abroad? Only in the most limited of circumstances, and only when we stop reflexively thinking that every mob that pits itself against autocratic rulers is made up of heroes and patriots, as Senators Graham and McCain recently said. We have to ask, do the people we would aid have an appreciation for freedom and a readiness to fight for it themselves? More importantly, are they ready to fight for the freedom of their fellow citizens and able to live and work with them? Are they willing to live under a government and the rule of law that both empowers and restrains their democratic majority? Are they, moreover, eager to live in peace with their foreign neighbors? If the answer to those questions is yes, If the answer to those questions is yes, then, and I would think only then, might it be worth and would it be worth our blood and treasure to help. Thank you. How's that for an upbeat talk in the middle of the week?
On that stunningly optimistic note, maybe we can take a few questions. We like at the Potenziani program in Constitutional Studies to start with our undergraduate students. So if there's an undergraduate student that has a question, we'll let you go first. If not, we'll open it up to just anyone. Please, Alex.
Yeah, this might be a little bit breaking into a different concentration of international relations, or public design specifically into international relations. But with your talk, it sounds like that those adherents of DPT, democratic peace theory, we might as well abandon it because it will never work. And the only reason it has worked thus far is that because the liberal democracies in the world are just that, they're liberal democracies. They're not, it's not democracy, it's the liberal that seems to be working to keep the peace amongst those nations.
Can I just have you repeat the question so we get it on the microphone?
Yeah. Question was, does democratic peace theory hold any substantial value? Does it hold water? Or is it that does it seem that democracies promote peace because it's been liberal democracies that we've been looking at and studying, not other forms of democracy? Something like that? Okay, good enough. Yeah, I think we have to understand something very, very sad, frightening even. It's true. America, liberal democracies don't fight other liberal democracies. I think I could probably lay out 4 or 5 reasons why. There may be many more. A good senior thesis for you would be to find out why it is that liberal democracies don't fight other liberal democracies. I mean, the very thought that we would, bomb Costa Rica or, invade France or shell Poland. We're going to march on Canada. It's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. You could bet on it. But it doesn't mean that America is a peaceful country. I mean, I'm certain that at least a third of our life has been spent in war. I mean, if you think the past century, we're a democracy. We fought a war in Mexico, fought a war against Spain, invaded Panama, sent troops to Nicaragua, sent troops to Haiti and Dominican Republic, engaged in a First World War against Germany, against a Second World War against Germany, Italy, other Axis powers, then turned on our former ally in Japan, turned on our former ally, the Soviet Union, had a Cold War against them. We've spent the last number of years, then Bosnia, then Afghanistan, then Kuwait, then Iraq. Democracies are not peaceful countries. Liberal democracies, vis-a-vis other liberal democracies, are unbelievably peaceful. Democracies tend to be warlike. Tyrants, who are always a little worried about if they're going to wake up the next morning, aren't so happy about war all the time. I mean, war is a danger for them. But democracies, they always think that they could do whatever they can do. So the promotion of democracy as a way to reach peace, I think, is another fool's errand. The promotion of liberal democracies, as Kant would say, to reach universal peace, is, I think, a correct thing to do. I would promote liberal democracies anywhere and everywhere I could, but the operative word is liberal. Sure. You're not an undergraduate. All right, we'll make believe you are. Okay.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm listening to it in the context of reading a lot about McGeorge Bundy and the Kennedy and Early Johnson administration thinking about Vietnam. And there are a lot of sort of similarities. A great optimism that whether it's economic development or political development not only will be good in terms of producing an ally, but also will be doing good by doing what doing good by doing well in terms of advancing a moral agenda. And so, I've long thought that the project in Iraq especially had a lot of similarity to the optimism of the new frontier in the 1960s. Now, the question is, if you accept that, there's a sort of bipartisan impetus to this. And in fact, the war in Iraq had largely bipartisan support. Over 72% of the public and major figures in both parties, supported the invasion, at least in March of 2003. So, there was something about our political system that attracted us to this enterprise, as it attracted us to the enterprise in Southeast Asia during the Cold War. And I think that what it is that attracts us to this is liberalism. I think America is basically a big L liberal country, and what unifies us under liberalism is more significant than what divides us. And I think everything you say about the lack of liberalism in other parts of the world is important, and it's a big part of the story of the failure in this instance and the failure in Vietnam as well. I wonder if you would go further and accept the argument that our own liberalism may also be part of the sad story that you're depressing us with this afternoon. In two senses. One is, at least according to Louis Hart's, liberalism has a dark side to it. And the dark side is that there's an intolerance behind it that basically says anybody that isn't liberal is evil, or at least very threatening. And the other aspect of our liberalism that I guess personally see leading us astray is the confidence that you challenged at the beginning of your talk, that everybody else out there really wants this, and if they don't have it, it's a function of one bad guy like Saddam Hussein, or 40 years earlier that the country was just underdeveloped and didn't have a per capita GDP of $4,000. And then if you accept all that, then a big part of the story is not only the lack of liberalism in these other countries around the world, but maybe something about our own view of the world rooted in our liberal tradition.
I have no doubt that everything you said is absolutely true. We have a sort of a missionary zeal about the American way of life. We love it. We love it. Can't believe, and in our generosity, can't believe that other people don't deserve to live the same way too. And we hate it when we see, you want to know why I went to Iraq? Was because I read Tom Friedman's articles in the New York Times. And every one of them was about this bad guy Saddam, whose sons would rape women and then make them bleed, who would kill for pleasure, whose sons had lions that they would throw people to and watch them get eaten. I said, this has to stop. This just has to stop. And so when it came time to go to say, you can't treat people that way, I jumped at it. I don't want to get in the issue whether we made things worse. I think the Arab Spring movement now is making things worse than what we did in Iraq. But yeah, but Americans never learned that nice guys finish last, and no good deed goes unpunished. I don't want to say that our generosity of spirit is something we should destroy, because it's important to us. It points to something good about Americans, that we really want to promote democracy, promote liberty, that we we do it in the most flat-footed way half the time, but that we really wanted to see the countries of Eastern Europe free from Soviet tyranny, that we really wanted, that we cheered the trade union movement and the solidarity movement in Poland. Good things. But we just have to learn what it is we're doing and learn, I mean, you people in constitutional studies, learn what the founders were trying to do. Learn why it is that the word democracy doesn't appear once in the Constitution. Doesn't even appear in the Declaration of Independence, of all places. Hamilton could call democracies, wretched nurseries of instability, discord, and not mayhem, but something like that. Madison could always say that democracies have historically been turbulent and unjust. Now, they still wanted to establish some kind of popular government, some kind of democracy, some kind of popular rule. But they didn't want it. They wanted to resolve the defects of older democracies. They wanted to have remedies for the ills of democracy. And I think they did a very good job of it. They did such a good job of it, we say, hey, this is easy. Look at this. If stupid Americans could do it, anybody in the world could do it. It's just not true. The State Department is not full of James Madisons. But you're right. I translate it as the evil that we do stems from the generosity of our natures. We're...
The theological phrase, the road to hell is paved with goodness.
Yeah, and it is. It is. But don't forget, we've done this all the time. People always say to me, America's not so good, you had slaves. And of course we had slaves. The amazing thing is not that we had slaves, but that there were hundreds of thousands of Americans who would say, as he died to help make men holy, let us die to make men free. Let us die to make men free. And die they did. That's the amazing thing. That's what they did. They went to for free people they wouldn't have dinner with. But they went to free them and they died. That's the amazing thing. That's the sort of unnatural, unbelievable thing about our culture. Yes, please.
Would you say that there's any danger of America's populace leaning towards a kind of sectarianism? And that would
Start from the beginning slower.
David, stand up so we can hear you.
Would you say that there's any danger of America's populace forming a kind of sectarianism that would destabilize our democracy, or are there other kind of cultural stalwarts in place that would prevent us from doing that, whether it be our government or other factors?
Are we in danger of having our religion become fanatical? Is that what you're saying? I don't think so. I hear this all the time. People say, there are fundamentalists over there and there are fundamentalists over here. The day that I see a nun put some bombs under her habit and go into a marketplace to blow up kids is the day I'll believe that there's that we're talking apples and apples. Or the day when, sort of Methodists go out to kill Presbyterians is the day I'll believe that we have that kind of trouble. And I hear it. You hear it in the media a lot. You don't hear it. Ordinary people don't say it, but the media says it. That the right, the Christian right, just as intolerant. Duh. What planet are you living on to say the Christian right is just as intolerant as a Taliban terrorist? It's just not, and it's not going to happen. Not going to happen. The most amazing thing, and America is becoming more and more tolerant than after the Second World War, during the Second World War, at the beginning of the Second World War, what did the most liberal government in the United States do? It rounded up all the East Coast Japanese it could and put them in concentration camps or detention centers. Even to call them concentration camps is to make the wrong comparison. Put them in detention centers. We fight a war in Iraq. We don't round up Iraqis. We don't round up Muslims. We just don't do it. And in fact, any thought that there might be some kind of awkwardness towards the Muslim or Islamic community, immediately it's, you got to be careful. Mayor Bloomberg will go on the TV, and all of a sudden you'll all be called fascists. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen. Part of it is, and part of why it's not going to happen with religion is both good and bad. I mean, in some ways, we have so tamed religion in this country that religion strikes us as the most eviscerated and emasculated thing. Religion's just nice. I mean, George Bush would always say, don't all religions teach peace? And he thought the answer was yes. What planet was he from, It's not true. All religions do not teach peace. All religions do not teach the brotherhood of man. Face facts. But we've so prettified religion in this country. We've made religion a kind of choice, and isn't it nice that you could have this religion or that religion or no religion at all if you'd like? I remember when I was first in Iraq, there was a young man there sent by the State Department, and he would go around and talk to Iraqis about religious freedom. And he'd say, this is really what you need to have here, because in America, you could be any religion you want or no religion at all, and that's wonderful. And they would say, you could be no religion, you could not believe in God, you could say bad things about God, you could say bad things about the Quran, you could say bad things about the Prophet. If you did that, you should be killed. And he and I had no idea that what he was promoting as a virtue or a value, they saw as something horrible. I learned I couldn't even use the word secular, that we're going to have secular universities, because secular immediately got translated as godless, or even God-hating. So you had to say the university adheres to no religious sect. The university takes no sides. But to say you were secular, what we take so casually as that's a real good, that you have freedom of religion, they took to be so that my sons might abandon the religion of my father. That's horrible. Yeah.
I'd like to focus on what you said at the end. You only encourage aspiring.
Do us a favor, stand up. A little hard here.
Okay. When you said that we should only kind of encourage and help aspiring Democrats that are, that we know are peaceful and, have liberal ideas. An argument that I've heard recently, specifically referring to Syria, was that if we had aided them in their struggle against Bashar al-Assad when the fighting was early and before it was taken over by now, I think, more extremists, and then maybe not a liberal democracy would have formed, but maybe one that would have been, or that could potentially be less inimical to our interests. So I was wondering if you had any perspective on that.
Yeah, I hear that. I don't believe a bit of it. That was part of the extortion of the radical Syrian movement. That you don't give us money, arms, and munitions. We're going to turn to the bad guys. Well, even your very saying that means you've already turned to the bad guys, and you just want money, material, and munitions. Syria is one of those places where no good will come of it. There was nothing we could do, no side we could have taken. We certainly didn't want to take Assad's side, and we certainly now, knowing what we know about the rebels, who are probably going to win, things will be even worse with them. Christians will be in danger. I mean, Israel never had a great relationship with Assad, but its relationship with the radicals, the rebels, when they win, is going to be with Syria on one side and Egypt on the other, and the Palestinian Authority on the last side are going to be in really tough shape. Sometimes the other thing we have to learn about American power is we don't have a magic wand. We don't. Sometimes it's not just a choice between the lesser of evils. Sometimes both evils are just equally horrible, and you don't have a choice. Should we be involved in Syria? I don't think so. Is our non-involvement making things worse? I don't think so. It's as bad as could be, and will be as bad as could be. Yes, gentleman here in the front, yes.
You said a few times, you were talking initially about human nature and certain things being naturally either just or unjust. And then you just went on to explain why promoting democracy is not a viable strategy in Iraq and presumably lots of other parts of the Middle East and the world. I wonder, though, if we do actually believe in something like natural justice, whether it would be worthwhile to maybe not promote democracy, but promote something. I mean, you could say constitutional monarchy, you could call it constitutional aristocracy, some sort of or republic, regime that might still be run by various tribal leaders, something like that, would have maybe certain principles enshrined that would stop, say, throwing people to lions and sort of things like that we don't tend to like very much. Or whether we are just sort of in a situation where people in the Middle East are going down to the next 5,000 years just as well as the previous 5,000 to live under despotic tyrants.
Right. I think what you say is very smart. We cheered when the president of Tunisia was overturned. And now, just watch Tunisia. It's a bad place, soon to be even worse. Bad for them, bad for us, bad for the region. But the guy who ran Tunisia was hardly a democratic ruler. But he was a million times better than what we will soon have in Tunisia. Mubarak, hardly a person you would want to sit down and have a drink with. But when it came to protecting American interests, not going to war with Israel, generally just keeping the lid on things in a country where treaties were still being honored, 1,000 times better than what came afterwards. I think the same probably could be said about Bahrain. Certainly the same could have been said about Musharraf in Pakistan. Musharraf was a son of a bitch. Everybody knows he was. But he was our son of a bitch. Come on. And perfectly fine not to have cheered his overthrow. So constitutional monarchies are, if they work for the good of the people, are perfectly fine ways of governing. Real aristocracies, even, and some of these things are much more acceptable to the culture and customs and habits of a people. Lawyer Jirgas in Pakistan, where the tribal leaders and the elders would actually hold sway. It strikes them as far more natural than going out and voting. Sure, the old men of the tribe, they're the people who are going to tell us what to do. Maybe someday I'll be an old man of the tribe and then I'll have my turn, but we don't have to have democracy. We have good people, our fathers who were governing this place. We make a fetish out of democracy. And I don't think we should. Don't forget, in the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't say that the problem with George III was that he was a king. The problem was that he was a bad king. Had he been a good king, had he listened to what we wanted to do, we would never have. I mean, we don't think Vatican City is a bad place to be just because it's not a democracy. I imagine it could be, but it ain't. It's okay. Yeah, let's do. I'm talking too much. Yeah, a couple more.
Stand up so we can hear you.
After the 9/11 attacks, George Bush kept tweeting, terrorists were attacking us for our freedoms. I was just wondering what you thought about that statement. And also, do you think negative outlooks on America stems from our our preventative war policies or interventionist policies and act as like an international policeman? Can you talk about that?
I think that was, I heard George Bush say that a lot. I have no idea what he meant by it. They're attacking us for our freedoms. If they were jealous of our freedoms, then you think they'd want them, but they don't seem to want them. And why would they attack us because we have freedoms? If those freedoms are bad things, I think their view should be, well, let them stew, But it made no sense. I'm no great fan of George Bush's, but and I don't mean to pick on him, but he said a lot of dopey things, let's say. The question then it went on to, does our acting as policemen to the world and our interventions, does that put us in a bad predicament? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I listen to Ron Paul say, the reason we got all this stuff is because we went in 58 or whenever it was into Iran and overthrew a democratically elected government and set up the Shah. Therefore, that's why they hate us over there. Duh. Okay. Number one, why are we the only country in the world not allowed to pursue our own interests? Everybody else pursues their interests. We're not allowed to do it. Okay, it makes no sense. Number two, do you really think that that's behind the Islamic Revolution? Come on, it's not. Islamic Revolution they're not children, and they're not, sort of unaware of what they want. What they want is the establishment of their religion as predominant, either in their region, as it would be in Saudi Arabia, or more widespread.
In the back corner somewhere?
Yeah, that woman there.
I have a quick question just about your talk in general. You started in some ways to intertwine the terms morality and democracy. And so what I was getting from that was you thought maybe there was a problem in America where we decided that democracy is our morality or our basis for morals, and we're trying to, push that on other people. Is that kind of the basis where you see the problem in the mindset of Americans?
I don't know that that's what I meant. Maybe I said it, but I didn't mean exactly that.
Some people say it's democracy is substituting for a kind of moral basis in this country, because to say that religion is just a nice thing, but we have all this fervor for democracy. What I got from that was you're thinking maybe we want to substitute for another.
I don't know quite how to answer that, because it's actually I think foreign from what I was saying. But no, we don't try to promote our religion abroad. That we don't do. Do we try to promote our morality abroad? Yeah, insofar as we understand that our morality is that peace is good, and people shouldn't hurt their neighbors, and we say, well, part of being just is being democratic, and I think that's a step too far to say that. And when I did say that we, for moral reasons, acting on sort of biblical precepts to love your neighbor, help those in need, when we do that, I guess we're acting on both religious / moral precepts, but those I don't think we actually get from our democracy. Those I think we get from our religion. Protestant or Catholic or whatever.
You
so,
agree that, I think what you
she means something I'm not catching.
You would agree that we have assumed democracy as such is a moral good.
Yes.
Is that what you're getting
That's
at?
kind of what I'm getting
Yeah.
at. Yeah.
And that is a mistake in your view.
Yeah, I think democracy is a means. It's not an end. So I wouldn't say that democracy is of itself a good. It depends on the character of that democracy.
There's two gentlemen who have been waiting for quite a long time. The fellow right here, and then I know Tom over here. Let's get both your questions at the same time.
I'll stay for as long as you want.
Yeah. And then we'll break formally, and then we can have people come up. So why don't you ask your question, and Tom ask yours.
Sure. Actually, I find your presentation quite inspiring in many ways, and I do agree that democracy is not the end itself, but more the liberal values. I do have some very important objections. First of all, we have characterized I would say Western society, because I put myself in the West and not American. You have characterized the Western culture as being most promoting liberties and the individual, importance of the individual, and the Islamic culture as being promoting of a submissive and somehow, let yourself be dominated behavior, which I find at least biased and stereotypical, if not racist and Islamophobic. And I would say you would agree that Islamic people would characterize that in a different way. My second objection...
I'm not sure of that. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Builds on that, and I would object that your argument suffers from fundamental attribution error. Everything you're saying about the American behavior and intention is highly positive. And I can tell you as, let's say, European, from the European perspective, we are more cynical about that. While every intention of the Islamic society, society seems to be somehow to do bad, not to mention generalize that. And my third thing is that you have said that it would never happen in American societies. Well, you seem to forget about, coming back to the fundamental missionary, about context and how much context matters. And there's quite a very high correlation between the standard of living and between the state of the economy and the level of liberties and how much people respect each other's liberties. I mean, it has happened in Europe before World War II. It has happened in Eastern Europe after the communists fell. It's happening now in the Middle East and Northern Africa. How it has happened in the US as well. I mean, let's look at Guantanamo Bay. In times of crisis, especially economic crisis, sorry, not Guantanamo Bay, those prisons, I forgot the name. Anyway, in times of crisis, even some of the more liberal democracies forget about this individual liberties. And I would doubt that Western society doesn't do that. We have examples of Islamophobia increasing all around in Western society. And you say you would not see a nun with a bomb. Probably not, but we have Andres Breivik in one of the most liberal societies, definitely much more liberal now than the US, in Norway, which is has shocked everybody, but you could say it's similar to the scale of the 9/11. What would be your answer to, especially the law school?
Well, there are 3 points there. I'm going to forget, what order to answer them. I don't think Islamophobia is growing in the West. I know we just disagree on that. And what, you want to go out and fight about it? Come on, we could do that. I'll try. Well, we're not going to go fight about it. You're right. We're absolutely not. That's the point. We're just not going to do it. And in fact, I would still stick to my view that we tend to be, now compared to 50 years ago compared to 100 years ago, we've become more and more tolerant. We simply have. I think Europe has too. Certainly since the Second World War, Europe has. Am I painting with too broad a brush about Islamic societies? Yes. I did all my work in the last half of my time in Iraq up in the Kurdish region. And the Kurds are as calm and peaceful and fun-loving and freedom-loving as a people you could want to find. Are they Muslim? You bet. But the singular thing about the Kurds is that they're not terribly religious. Religion doesn't drive them. Religion is to them something cultural. They'll celebrate festivals, maybe. I did not know one Kurd who prayed. Not one. We had some students who wanted to, at the university I started, or some Kurdish students wanted to have a mosque in the university. And we said, no, we're not going to establish a prayer room or a mosque in the university. They said, well, we're going to go on strike. We want one here. We want time off 5 times a day when we're at school to pray. We said, there's a mosque down the street at lunchtime. Just go there. They said, nah, that's too much trouble. Forget about it. Religion just was not serious to them. Other things were serious. What was serious, as you seem to have mentioned, was making money. Making money. The passion for money making overcame the passion for religious purity. And so, do I want to say, be careful, all Muslims, or even all Iraqis are the same? No. But those who are driven by religious fervor have to be careful of. They really are, and I think we fool ourselves by thinking that there are just a few of them. They're not really a lot of them. I mean, think about the media saying, yeah, the people will vote for the Muslim Brotherhood, but 10% of the population at most. And then maybe 20%. And then all of a sudden they win the elections, and then we find out that they're in league with even more radical people than they themselves are. Okay, it may shock Europeans, but that, I'm used to Europeans being shocked by all kinds of crazy things. It's okay. No, it's not that Islam is. Islam has been for a long time quiet and peaceful and fair-minded religion. But it has now, seems to be elements of it on the march. And I really take great exception to George Bush saying that this part of the Islamic world are not really Muslims. Well, how the hell does he know? And who set him up as Pope to decide? It does seem that an awful lot of the Islamic world, the people who we are most afraid of, are the core, are the great majority. But yeah, you said something about economics too.
Allow me to be constructive in here. I'm wondering, it's obvious that what has happened in Iraq and Afghanistan was a failure and was not a really the good strategy. And I do agree that promoting democracy itself sounds kind of a, if not bad, at least a stupid objective. I'm wondering, and it's actually a real question, I have no answer to that. Isn't China's strategy of not intervening in terms of values, in terms of culture, just business, just trying to develop business, somehow promoting, surprisingly, promoting freedom and liberties more than American strategy?
I don't know if it's promoting liberty or freedom more, but I...
True business, that's what
true, but yeah. The other part of our going into Iraq was not only to bring democracy, but actually to bring business, to bring free enterprise, to bring some understanding of free trade and capitalism. We failed there too. There was the other part of it's not that we only thought democracy brings peace and freedom. We thought that modern economics, business, that turns people away from wanting to, the Kurds, for example, and it worked in Kurdistan. I mean, every Kurd, if you say, I give you a choice, do you want to open a Nissan factory, a Nissan showroom, you want to sell Nissans, or do you want to cut off the infidel's ear? He says, forget the ear, I want to have a Nissan factory, I want to have a company. Every one of them, every single one of them. The people in Arab Iraq that I met, I don't know, I'm not sure. It depends on how bad an infidel he is, we had an impossible time, and failed, trying to make commerce, business, the substitute for other passions. And we thought, hey, the younger generation, they're really going to want to take business administration and finance and marketing and advertising. They had no interest. They really had no interest. The Kurds did, but not south of Kurdistan. But we had a question and we've avoided it.
Tom, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to bring your question to John after we shut down. We're past our time.
So
we have we do.
God, you are so rule bound here at Notre Dame.
Authority, actually. We have our John's book outside, and he'll sign some copies. And I'm sure stick around to answer any more questions you might have. Thanks for coming, and please join me in thanking Professor Agresto.
Thank you. Oh, yes.